Are you a fan of technology news? Then the Tech Meme Ride Home is a must-subscribe. For 15 years, TechMeme.com has been the website Silicon Valley checks every day for the latest news. And now, every day at 5 p.m., there's a 15-minute podcast that breaks down the latest news in tech, the coolest gadgets, the latest apps, the biggest funding raises, the most recent social media scandals. The Tech Meme Ride Home is like NPR's Marketplace, but for tech news. A daily, easy-to-understand summation of the latest in the world of technology. Open up your podcast app right now and search Ride Home. Then subscribe and listen to the Tech Meme Ride Home podcast. Again, search your podcast app for Ride Home and subscribe to the Tech Meme Ride Home.
Tonight, Western democracy is under unprecedented threat after yet another week that's seen both President Trump and European populists chip away at our bedrock values. I sit down with the former British Prime Minister Tony Blair, who tells me that if we want to protect the gains of globalization and the liberal democratic world order, we must deal with its consequences. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the program. I'm Amanpour in London. This week has seen strongmen consolidate gains and democracies struggle to hang on to basic values and principles. The Turkish president, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, was re-elected with sweeping new powers, sparking fear of a further crackdown on civil society. And it's been announced that the Russian leader Vladimir Putin will get some important FaceTime with President Trump in Helsinki next month, sparking anxiety amongst NATO allies, especially in light of CNN reports that Trump calls NATO just as bad as NAFTA. This fresh off Trump beating up on Europe's longtime leader, the German Chancellor Angela Merkel, via Twitter for her immigration policy. This week also a worrying new study commissioned by the former President George W. Bush and the former Vice President Joe Biden. It found that more than half of all Americans believe democracy is vulnerable in the USA, an idea that would have been unthinkable a decade ago when the likes of President Bush and Prime Minister Tony Blair were wrapping up their terms in office. Well, Blair is still speaking up, defending old alliances and a globalized world, and calling on politicians to do their jobs and fight the false promise of populists by finding workable solutions. From the United States to the frontiers of Europe, crying out for a solution is migration, something Blair says must be addressed if our liberal democracies are to have a fighting chance against today's new breed of populists. We sat down together at his office here in London. Prime Minister Blair, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
You have just given a speech which might sound a little sort of, disconnected from reality in defense of globalization.
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah, absolutely. When you take a step back and look at the broad sweep of history, globalization and the general process of the world opening up to each other has brought enormous benefits to the world. It's lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. It's given us prosperity. It's allowed us to live and think and work quite differently. And of course, it's got its challenges. But, globalization, you look back over it, yeah, of course it's benefited mankind.
So how do you convince people of that narrative? Because it does seem to be alternative narratives are winning the day. How do you tell people 2 or 3 years into the populist wave that actually that's not the answer to your political, economic and social problems?
Because you've got to deal with people's underlying grievances. So if you're in European politics today and you're not dealing with the issue of immigration, then you're going to get this populism on the rise. And you can't, the difference I think with myself and other people on the more progressive pro-globalization side of the argument is that I don't think the concerns and anxieties are illegitimate at all. On the contrary, I think they've got to be dealt with by vigorous government action. But that is the right way of dealing with them, not pushing back against the whole process of globalization.
Is anybody doing it right to your mind right now? Is Chancellor Merkel doing it right? Is President Macron doing it right? Is anybody addressing this particular issue in the correct way right now?
Well, I think that those mainstream European politicians are. I think what Macron is doing in France particularly is steering a path on immigration, on reform, on other things, which is allowing us, or allowing France, as it were, to say, we keep basic principles of social solidarity, but we're going to have to reform our economy, and on migration and basic adherence to the values of our country, we've got to be tough on it. And, for example, if people are coming in from majority Muslim countries into our countries, we've got to say, here are the rules. There's a shared space for diversity, and there's a common space. Just treating people equally, and there's no amount of cultural difference that can entitle you to discriminate against gay people or discriminate against women or believe that the rule of law shouldn't apply to you. So these are basic, these are if you want to protect the gains of globalization, you've got to deal with the consequences, deal with the people who feel they're casualties of it, and particularly on this immigration issue, since I think this populism is at least as much driven by cultural questions as economic, you've got to be clear about people's anxieties, which are real and are not unjustified.
So how do you think, and what do you think of the way President Trump has dealt with the US-Mexico border, for instance, and saying things that don't comport with the facts and with evidence, saying things like they bring more crime in when statistics and bipartisan studies show that actually migrant and immigrant neighborhoods have historically less crime than Americans, so to speak.
Right, so again, my point is very simple. If you don't deal with the problem, reasonable people don't deal with it, other people come along and exploit it. If you're, for example, saying to the Italians right now, look, we're just not dealing with your problem. You've just got to take these people in. There's nothing we can do about it. That's just the way it is, and that's consistent with European values. You're going to have a rebellion on your hands, and you're going to have people, and now you do have people, who are going to come and exploit that issue and whip up prejudice. But people want rules. So as I say, I'm not so familiar with the Mexico-USA situation, but if I was in the Democrat Party at the moment, I would be saying, okay, I can condemn what the president is doing in this respect and that respect.
The separation of children and families,
and all of that, obviously, but I need to work out how to deal with this anxiety then in a reasonable way. And part of it, of course, may be producing a gateway for people to come in and be legitimized and so on. But part of it is going to be making sure there are proper border controls and so on, because people expect governments to do that. And we need a proper system of identifying who's got a right to be in Europe and who's not. So, for example, in the British context, I've said, we should have an electronic system of identity. I mean, we should be entitled to know who's here and who's not.
What does that mean exactly?
Well, it means that the old idea you'd have an identity card, you actually can today simply, through technology, have an electronic identity which shows exactly who you are. You can actually put a whole lot of privacy measures around that, but that allows you to access government services and to show that I've got a right to be here. And for a country like Britain at any one time, we will have hundreds of thousands of people who have outstayed their welcome or are here illegally. People want us to deal with that. And what I always say to people is, if you don't have rules, you'll have prejudices. So, the choice, if you're trying to deal with these populist surges, is to realize most people aren't unreasonable. You provide them with a proper solution, they'll buy the solution. If you don't provide them with a solution, they'll buy the anger.
You've said that the populist solution is not the answer. That will not answer the public's anxieties, particularly about migration, about economics, about feeling left behind. But it's really gaining traction, and it's not just populism on the right, it's populism on the left as well.
Yeah, sure, because when people are pessimistic, and this is where you've got to think through a new policy agenda for changing times, but when people are pessimistic, they look for people to blame, and the right tends to blame immigrants, and the left tends to blame business, and neither's a solution. Now, what we're trying to do in the Institute here is to develop a policy agenda that might be called more centrist, if you like, but which is focused on things like, well, this technological revolution is going to change so much. It's got enormous benefits, but it's going to have displacement effects. How do you access the benefits and deal with the risks? This type of policy formulation, making sure that, for example, you're building the infrastructure that you require for the mid-21st century. All of these things, reforming your tax system, your benefit system, dealing with that 10% of the population that's kind of cut adrift, all of these things require radical but sensible policy solutions.
Do you feel that all of this has conspired to put democracy at risk in the Western Alliance and also in other countries that are nominally democratic?
I sort of, it depends how I feel when I wake up each morning. Some mornings I feel, yes, it does, and other mornings I feel, well, maybe that's just too far-fetched. I tell you what I do think, though. I think the fracturing of our society culturally into two groups of people who don't talk to each other, listen to each other, or like each other is a problem. And I think you've got this in the US right now. We've got this in Britain. And that's dangerous because democracy has got a spirit as well as a form. And the spirit is a bit of give and take, a recognition that what unites us is more than what divides us, and a willingness of the politicians to build bridges with those who disagree. If you get into a situation where your opponents become your enemies, that's a much more difficult politics to handle.
And that definitely is happening, wouldn't you say?
Yes, it is, yeah.
And what about the situation where...
And then, by the way, the media makes it worse in a sense. I don't mean this media, but the media, because the media commercial model is changing. It is the simplest thing for the media today is to take a group of people, wind them up into a state of permanent grievance, and keep them in that state, right, against the other people. And you see it right and you see it left, and I think social media amplifies that. It often distorts the nature of debate, and that fracture becomes, you see this when you read this crazy social media stuff in politics today. I mean,
so if you were Prime Minister still, or President of the United States, or wherever, what would you do to address that? Because that is really debilitating, and many Americans and Europeans bemoan that fact, the poisoning, the partisanship of politics. But at the same time, there's, every 2 seconds it seems there's a new study that shows, bipartisan study, the latest one in America, that potentially, I think it's 2/3 of the American people are concerned that their democracy is being eroded, are concerned that they might, sort of default into some kind of strongman autocracy. The times are sort of leading towards that direction.
Yeah, they are. And I think the way of dealing with it, if I was in office today, as I say, you've got to try and build those bridges, do it very openly. Understand what, if you're on the left, understand what makes people irritated with the left. If you're on the right, realize what makes the people on the progressive side of politics anxious. It requires a different mindset. And so, that's why if it was back in politics today, as I say, I would be dealing with these things that are fueling some of the right-wing populism, and also explaining to the people on the left where, of course you want to make sure you're promoting responsible business and social opportunity for people, but you need a thriving enterprise sector if the economy is to grow. So this is where I think you could, if you wanted to, build bridges. The trouble, I think one thing, certainly here, this is a big problem. I don't know how much is a problem with the US. To get selected as a candidate nowadays, you're often appealing to an activist base that doesn't really want to hear that message. I mean, they want to hear, red or blue meat. And that's dangerous.
Been putting off buying new glasses? Zenni Optical offers a huge variety of high-quality, stylish frames and state-of-the-art optics, starting at just $6.95. We've got all the great frame styles you want in materials like titanium, carbon fiber, and high-luster acetate. Plus, Zenni offers prescription glasses and sunglasses. So at this great price, you can build your eyewear wardrobe. You can get 10% off your entire order with code 360. So visit Zenni, Zenni, today at zennioptical.com and use code 360.
Hey, it's Howard Beck, and I've got Brian Scalabrine on Bleacher Report's The Full 48.
Dude, Shaq's the most dominant player I've ever played against. It's not even close.
Yeah.
I hacked Shaq so hard one time, as hard as I possibly could. And he went up and dunked it like I wasn't even there. You want to talk about a grown man feeling insignificant? I felt that was the most insignificant I felt in my entire life.
So check out The Full 48 now on the Bleacher Report app or subscribe at Apple Podcasts.
From Chaplin to Aronofsky and The Thin Man to Magnolia, Filmstruck is the ultimate movie streaming service for fans of great cinema. This summer, enjoy collections from master directors like David Lean, Oliver Stone, and Yasujiro Ozu, and modern favorites like Before Sunrise and Reservoir Dogs. Plus, exclusive interviews and commentary from the Criterion Collection and Turner Classic Movies. Filmstruck, all the greats. For a free 14-day trial, visit filmstruck.com.
to put you a few points that have been made in many articles just as they're looking towards what's happening in the foreign policy sphere, particularly in the aftermath of the G7 summit. I think it was a big shock for a lot in the foreign policy establishment to see something that we haven't seen, a president of the United States, nominally the leader of the Western world, beating up on his own allies, beating up on the very, not just personally against, for instance, Prime Minister Trudeau, against Chancellor Merkel, but on the whole system, to the point that President Trump withdrew America's signature from the final communique and wouldn't condone the sentence, international rules-based order. What do you make of that, first and foremost?
Well, to those of us used to dealing with G7 summits, it's obviously fairly shocking. But I think we've got to stay engaged with the American administration from the European perspective. And there are a lot of Europeans right now that think that this president, this administration just don't care about the transatlantic alliance and indeed regard it as having had its day. I don't think that's true. I think what is an unresolved question for me is whether this administration and the president are prepared, as it were, to approach America first as not inconsistent with America in alliance with others. And, even when the president came to the International World Economic Forum in Davos and said America first doesn't mean America alone, that registered with the Europeans. But
it looks like he's changing. Now more people are saying it's America alone.
You see, if you've got real trade issues, for example, the points that America's raising with China, by the way, are perfectly sensible. You could probably get European support for raising those. It's a lot to do with how it's done. And I think the actual question for a lot of Europeans, and I'm not in a position to answer this, is does the president really consider a necessary part of his political appeal in America that he actually does not seek their support? That in a sense, this kind of unilateral action is part of the aura of the presidency. Now, I personally would doubt that, because I think you can see perfectly well and sensibly the value of the alliance. But I think, for example, one of the things that's important for Europeans to say to America right now is when you're dealing with the emerging power of China, which is, it's still an understated geopolitical fact, but everywhere I go in the world, I see China more and more powerful. And by the way, that is perfectly natural and in a sense right. China deserves to be in that position of power. But it's going to pose big challenges to the West and to America. If you have Europe divided and isolated and individual countries dealing with China without some collective sense of Western solidarity, they're going to get picked off. They're going to be poor allies to America in that.
And if you have an America sort of withdrawing, it's going to allow China the space to take over.
Absolutely. So this is basic power politics. So if the Europeans, and this is where the British position with Europe is also so important, because Britain, I think, is more robust always in ensuring people understand the importance of the American alliance. So if that seems to fracture and you take America's foremost ally out of that European alliance, you've got individual countries dealing with China. Look, I know this very well, what will happen. They will find it much easier to deal with individual countries which can slightly play
one off against the other.
And this is just power politics, not a criticism of China. I mean, America does that in its own way. So it's, there's no criticism, but we have to understand that our basic value system of governance, Western democracy, and what it stands for, independent media, rule of law, free speech, electing your government, that is a system under challenge today. And for the first time since the 1950s, there are a group of countries who are saying, your system doesn't work and ours works better. Now, in those days, it was the Soviet Union which said, we may not be democratic, but we can deliver for our people more efficiently, more productively than you can. Now, in the end, they lost that battle. But they didn't lose it simply because democracy was a better idea. They lost it also because democracy delivered more for its people. Today, you've got this strongman concept of government, it's a shorthand for the idea you need one leader they take the decision, they drive the thing through, and it's got attractions for people.
So let me ask you to respond to this. This is from the Brookings Institute. Make no mistake, there is a concerted attack on the constitutional liberal order, and it's being spearheaded by the President of the United States. It's bad. Yeah. What do you think about that?
I think that's an exaggeration. I mean, I think it's... What I'm saying is we need to understand what this value system is about. And, you know, I remember going back in time when there are very, very sharp, hard disagreements inside American politics. And, you know, again, sometimes you think, well, is this qualitatively different? And there are people I know who will say, yes, it definitely is. I think from the point of view of the international sphere, no, I think it is still possible and achievable that America and Europe can see eye to eye, and that, you know, whatever the peculiarities of the way your political system seems to work at the moment, and by the way, we've got our own peculiarities, you know, I still think we can make sense of that. So,
you have been Prime Minister under several presidents. With Clinton, you had more of a political alignment, but you were also good friends and allies with President Bush, Republican president. But he, as you remember, whether it was the Iraq War or many of his policies, created a huge problem for America in the world, right? And President Obama was considered to have come in and put balm on those wounds and healed the division between America and the rest of the world. I guess I'm asking you to tell me whether you think Bush era was much more sort of divisive between America and the rest of the world, or the Trump era? Put it into your perspective.
Well, I mean, the context is different. You know, if you've got 9/11 and that attack on America, I mean, it shifted the whole pivot of American interests and foreign policy. The one thing I would say, because I obviously did work very closely with President Bush, is that although he created division, obviously, because the decisions were very difficult, he was always trying to put it back together again. So, you know, and I remember, for example, when we did the 2005 G7, he came there and specifically agreed to stuff on climate change that I don't think he was 100% signed up for, really, but he agreed it nonetheless. And, you know, launched what became a huge program, the PEPFAR program, and debt relief for Africa.
PEPFAR was, of course, to help with the AIDS crisis.
Yeah, which, by the way, is probably the largest life-saving program that the donor community has ever launched. And, you know, he did believe in that. And so what I think, and by the way, I think this could be done by this president and this administration. There are things they could do that could reignite a sense in Europe that, for all our disagreements, we're still fundamentally on the same side and pulling in the same direction. And I think the administration just needs to look for ways of doing that and then put that within an intellectual and geopolitical framework that Europe can understand.
What do you think of the former CIA director, Michael Hayden, saying the fact that America's president is doing his best to help that along, in other words, the collapse of the world order, is a shock to Berlin? We have never seen a US president egg on the undemocratic forces amongst our closest allies. Trump sees that Merkel is down and he's trying to finish her off. This also, well, what's your view of that? Because the US ambassador said that it's his job to, you know, promote conservative leaders across Germany and across Europe.
Yeah, I mean, I think the only thing I would say about this is that it's just, when you're dealing with international politics at a very high level, you know, I would always try and be mindful of the politics of the person I was dealing with, because, you know, their politics is difficult, your politics is difficult. Sometimes the politics of both people are in collision with each other in some way. You know, I'm not a big fan of all the tweeting stuff, I've got to say, but I think the most important thing is to rise above that in a bigger way on some clear, strong issues. And I think the upcoming NATO summit is a way of saying, even if, by the way, the president is perfectly correctly saying Europe's got to do more, of saying, and the reason you've got to do more. It's because this alliance matters. We're totally committed to it, and we'll carry on being committed to it.
One other question on this issue. Like Robert Kagan, the conservative scholar in the United States, has said, people forget that the post-Second World War order has been an aberration. It relied on America to keep it together. Under Trump, we're returning to a world of multipolar competition. That's very different and more dangerous world than the one we grew up in. Do you think this period of prosperity, peace, and the liberal world order, that he is an aberration? Are we going back to the Lord of the Flies?
You know, I've grown up with this, so it doesn't feel like an aberration to me. I guess if you go back through centuries, you can say it is. I think my response is to say, we do live in a multipolar world, but that's the reason why that part of the world that shares Western values and the Western democratic system has got to hold together. I mean, as China becomes more and more powerful, and you're going to have a world in which essentially you've got three giants, China, India, and America. You've got some tall countries, be Indonesia, Brazil, Mexico, and so on. And then you have some medium-sized ones like Britain and France and Germany. The medium-sized ones are going to have to band together. Otherwise, the giants will sit on them. That's the reason for Europe. And for those people, whether they're tall, the giant, or a medium-sized one, those who believe in Western values and the system of Western democracy, they're going to have to realize this is going to come under contest. So that's, I hope his view of the future turns out to be wrong, but the risks are very obvious, and it could turn out to be right unless we understand why it is we formed this system of Western values and why they're important and why they matter both to our way of life and to our prosperity.
And finally, many, many people are beginning to say, we just don't know what the truth is. And they're beginning to say to even mainstream organizations, well, everybody's biased. Obviously, this is fueled by President Trump and the whole fake news debate. But in the context of the Iraq War, people often say, listen, how can we trust governments? We believe they lied about the weapons of mass destruction. Anyway, this is having a follow-on effect. How toxic is not knowing the truth and thinking everything is relative to democracy? And what do you think of,
Yeah, no, it's absolutely corrosive of democracy. I mean, I just remind people on Iraq, agree with it or disagree with it, we had 6 different inquiries here which all found the same thing, which is the government may have been mistaken, but it didn't lie.
But people believe that. That's what I'm asking you.
But this is where I think it is the interaction of politics with the modern media environment that is also important, because if you do get a fragmentation of politics that then is echoed in the media, so that the media isn't, if it's a left media, it's not really prepared to give Trump anything. It just wants to pull him down, and the right media wants to support him right or wrong. Over time, it becomes very hard to have a debate. And then social media, boosts all of that, and so you get people spreading rumors and conspiracy theories and so on. Now, this is for a longer conversation for another time. But I think one thing that those of us who believe in democracy are going to have to do is think, what are the things we need to do to change the environment within which we work so that that democratic debate can be held on a basis where people can disagree, but at least there's some validity and integrity in the information upon which they're making their decision.
Tony Blair, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you.
So as he says, part of that solution, of course, must be when real debate can be heard, when real policy and not just bitter politics can be discussed. And that is it for our program tonight. Remember, you can always listen to our podcast. You can see us online at amanpour.com and follow me on Facebook and Twitter. Thanks for watching, and goodbye from London.